I'll talk about the spinal cord and then also those spinal nerves that we've referenced several times. Before we get into the actual spinal cord and the spinal nerves connected to it, I want to talk about how we protect it. That involves these three structures called meninges. Which we've actually talked about these. If you think back to the very first lecture of the semester, towards the end of that lecture, we learned about the different cavities of the body. And we talked about the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. One little line in that slide described these meninges. Okay, meninges are protective structures between the cranial bones, which are around the brain, and the vertebrae that are around the spinal cord. So in other words, the meninges that protect our brain and spinal cord are between the bone and the nervous tissue itself. Okay, and there's three of them, and that's why you will describe them as meninges. Okay, the singular form of that is meninx, although you'll probably just hear me call it meninge, which is not technically correct. Okay, but there's three layers, and we're going to start superficially. So this is the outermost layer, and then move deep. This would be the pia mater and the innermost layer. Okay. Now, all of them in the same way with the, it looks like mater, like in the movie Cars, but that's actually pronounced mater. Dura, arachnoid, and pia. Mater is actually a term that means mother. Okay. And then the first word describes a feature of that meninge. Okay. The dura mater is actually going to translate to mean tough mother. Okay. This is, think dura for durable, very tough. A tough membrane composed of dense, irregular connective tissue, and it is surrounded by what's called the epidural space. Let's talk about the epidural space. This is the space immediately superficial to the dura mater and just deep to the vertebrae, where you find a supporting cushion of fat and other connective tissues. And our picture here at the bottom, we can show on the outside, kind of in this white grayish shade, the dura mater, but we do not show the epidural space. Whereas down here, this actually does show you what we have in this picture is a vertebrae. In this case, it has to be a cervical vertebrae. I can tell you that for a variety of reasons. I won't get into it. But here you can see the body. There's the spinous process. You can see the little dark area right underneath or right deep to that bone is the epidural space. And then deep to that is where you find the dura mater, and then also, as you can see, labeled the arachnoid mater. Okay, you may have heard the term epidural, maybe not describing a space, but instead describing what? Pregnancy, an injection that a female gets during labor. Okay, it's a commonly done procedure just before the mother gives birth to the baby, in order to make the process of giving birth not quite as painful. And this is where they inject an anesthetic. Guess where they inject it? Into the epidural space, which helps make things, like I said, not quite as painful. The way that the anesthesiologist described it to my wife, if I remember correctly, it's been a few years, but they said this area is very thin. It's like the thickness of a sheet of paper, which obviously is very, very tiny. You can see it's pretty pronounced here, probably just things that kind of shrunk up a little bit after death. But pretty amazing that they're able to inject an anesthetic into such a small little space to provide relief to a laboring female. You can get epidurals for other procedures, but it's most commonly known for childbirth. Deep to the arachnoid mater, or deep to the dura mater is the arachnoid mater. If you don't know what arachnoid is, maybe you know what an arachnid is, which is a fancy term for anybody know? Spider. Okay. And I'll explain why we call this the spider mother. It's a thin avascular. Once again, avascular means doesn't receive blood flow. It's a covering composed of cells and thin, loosely arranged collagen elastic fibers. Here's why it's called the arachnoid motor. It gets its name because of its spider web arrangement of delicate collagen elastic fibers. So especially around the brain, which we'll see this stuff again on our next lecture. Okay, the arachnoid motor kind of looks like a spider web, and it's because of the collagen elastic fibers. It doesn't really show as much here in this figure, but we do see the arachnoid motor kind of in this purplish shade nonetheless. Between the arachnoid motor and the dura mater is what's called the subdural space. Now, if you don't know by now, the prefix sub means deep or below. So the subdural space is below or deep to the dura mater. So it's between the dura mater and the arachnoid motor, and it contains interstitial fluid. Finally, the innermost layer, pia mater. Pia means delicate. This is a delicate membrane adhering to the outer surface of the brain, or in this figure, the spinal cord. Consists of thin squamous to cuboidal cells with interlacing bundles of collagen fibers and some fine elastic fibers. Contains blood vessels supplying oxygen and nutrients to the spinal cord. And in the case of the spinal cord, there are triangular shaped extensions called denticulate ligaments. They are extensions of the pia mater that helps to spin the spinal cord in the middle of its dural sheath. Okay. And then just like between the dura and the arachnoid mater, between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is another space called the subarachnoid space, which I would highlight contains cerebrospinal fluid to provide support protection and a reservoir for circulating fluid. Our brain and spinal cord use to monitor the internal environment. Now, as far as the figures go, this is really cool to see the real deal, but not something I'm going to ask you to know. As far as this image goes, I do want you to know basically everything that's already capitalized for you. So the denticulate ligament, subarachnoid space, subdural space, and then the three meninges that are labeled here on the right. At the top, though, we do see some things like gray matter, white matter that we just talked about in our last lecture. These things labeled here on the right, we're going to talk about those here in just a little bit, but I'm not going to worry about it in this figure. Can you read that okay? Okay. There's stuff on the far right, so I wanted to zoom out a little bit so you could see it. A spinal tap? You know, I don't know exactly what that all involves. I know that's where they're checking for cerebrospinal fluid, so I'm guessing it's probably not the epidural space, but it's in the subarachnoid space. That's a good question. Yeah, I can't imagine any needle going into your back or anywhere in those meninges and spaces. Feels wonderful by any means. My poor wife, both of our boys, they really struggled to get her epidural, and our babies, they came screaming. They were fast pregnant, or they were fast deliveries, so she didn't really get any benefit to either. So she's a warrior for sure. Okay, on this page, we're just going to kind of talk about the spinal cord as an entire structure. What we'll describe here is what we call the external anatomy, and just kind of just general features of it as a whole structure. And then we'll get into kind of more parts of it here on the next couple pages. Our spinal cord is a structure extending from the medulla oblongata, which is the most inferior part of our brain, actually is what we see here at the top of this picture. It all goes all the way down to your second lumbar vertebrae, which if you think back a couple of weeks ago, there's 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then below the lumbar region is the sacrum and the coccyx. So in other words, what I'm getting at is that your spinal cord is not as long as your spinal column. It's much, much shorter. In fact, here is where it actually ends. The ending of our spinal cord is called the conus medullaris, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. Overall length of it is about 42 to 45 centimeters, or 16 to 18 inches in length. There are two enlargements of it that exist, and they're very subtle, but they are both labeled here. You can see the lumbar enlargement down here at the bottom, and then the cervical enlargement up there at the top. The cervical is the superior enlargement, extends from the fourth cervical vertebrae to the first thoracic. This is where the nerves to and from our upper limbs arise. So these nerves that you can see coming off right here are going to be the ones that feed our arms. Okay. The lumbar enlargement, also going by the term lumbosacral enlargement, is an inferior enlargement, which you might find a little bit odd, but extends from the 9th to the 12th thoracic vertebrae. So you might be wondering why it's the lumbar or lumbosacral enlargement. Well, the nerves to and from the lower limbs arise from this enlargement, and associated with it is what we call the lumbar and the sacral plexus, which are the branches, and we'll get into all this later in the lecture, that eventually, feed our legs. And the conus medullaris, already mentioned, is the tapering conical termination of the spinal cord. It is inferior to the lumbar enlargement, so this is where the spinal cord comes to an end. But as you can see, there are extensions that come down from that. Okay, and I'll go ahead and talk about that here now. Okay, because the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column, nerves that arise from the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal region of the spinal cord do not actually leave the column at the same level they exit the cord. Instead, they exit the vertebral canal like wisps of hair, and we call these roots cauda equina, which translates to mean horse's tail. And that's what it actually kind of looks like, wispy horse's tail. Okay. Now, labeled in this picture, we see a lot of abbreviations like C1 all the way down to S5. Okay, and those are referring to spinal nerves and spinal segments. Okay, on both sides of our spinal cord at regular intervals are a pair of spinal nerves, like these here, these here, these here. They're all associated with a specific segment of the spinal cord called the spinal segment. Okay, and so spinal cord appears segmented because of those 31 pairs emerging at regular intervals. Okay, and all these abbreviations here are referencing these spinal segments and the spinal nerves that are coming off. So in other words, this is spinal nerve segment or spinal segment C1. These nerves are C1 as well. Okay, T1 segment, T1 spinal nerves. Okay. Talked about it. Oh, I missed phylum terminology. Extension of the pia mater extends inferiorly and fuses with the arachnoid mater and dura mater to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx. We call this the phylum terminale. Okay. And that is actually something I want you to know in the image. There's not a whole lot that I want you to highlight, but here's what I want you to know. It's all stuff on the right side. Just highlight the cervical enlargements, the lumbar enlargements, the conus medullaris, cauda equina, and then the phylum terminale. Now, over on the left side of the figure are lots of nerves that are named, and then these structures that the nerves come off of, called plexuses. We're going to talk about those here later in the lecture. Not quite yet, though, so we'll hold off on that. I'll probably bounce back to this picture to kind of reference them. But for now, we'll just not worry about it. It's really impossible to tell those things apart anyway, so I'm not going to worry about it for this image. All right, moving into kind of more internal features of the spinal cord. We just learned in our last lecture, and I say just, it was just all of 15 minutes ago when we were in our last lecture. If you take a transverse section of the spinal cord, in other words, if you cut it horizontally, what you're going to find is on the outside will be a segment called the white matter, and then on the inside, which kind of looks like the letter capital H, is made up of gray matter. Okay, so there's an outer segment of white matter, and around again an inner core of gray matter. Okay. As we just learned, white matter is bright white in appearance due to the abundance of myelin. It is composed of bundles of axons of neurons called tracts, carrying signals from one part of the central nervous system to another. Okay. In the case of our spinal cord, the tracts essentially it can be thought of kind of like an elevator. I'll go ahead and jump down here and talk about these two things. Where, I always say, think of it like an elevator, which has two jobs, going up and going down. In the case of sensory or ascending tracks, those are the signals, or those are the tracks that are conducting those signals, those nerve impulses up toward the brain. Whereas motor or descending tracks are those that are conducting nerve impulses down from the brain. Okay, ascending means going up, descending means going down. And in the case of sensory, it means towards the brain, motor going away from. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about. I'll go ahead and talk about that stuff for the tracks. We'll talk about the rest of the stuff here that I've already skipped. Now, two grooves penetrate the white matter of our spinal cord, dividing it into right and left sides. What we call the anterior median fissure is a wide groove on the anterior side or the ventral side, whereas the posterior median sulcus is a narrow furrow on the posterior or dorsal side. And those are both labeled here in our figure at the bottom. It's important to kind of orient yourself. I don't really know why they've kind of put the picture, I don't know, kind of looks like it's crooked, but that's what they've done. Down here at the bottom, it's, more straightened, which I like a little bit better, but this is not the one I'm going to have you know for the exam. This one will be the one I want you to know. But it's important to orient yourself, what's anterior, what's posterior, because there's going to be a lot of things named, like the roots, the columns, etc., based on what's anterior and what's posterior. Okay. The first thing I always tell students to do is find the little slit that's here at the bottom. I'm using my cursor to highlight. Okay, that's called the anterior median fissure, and that tells you that this part of our spinal cord is anterior. Okay, and that was something that was mentioned up at the top of the page. I just read through. Down here at the bottom, we can see the anterior median fissure is labeled, and it's actually like almost as if somebody took a knife and just sliced right through the white matter. And you can actually see the white here is just like white over here. So it means we can actually see through it. You can't do that here on the back side with what's called the posterior median sulcus. Posterior median sulcus is more of just like a little depression, whereas the anterior median fissure is a actual slit. Okay. So now you know this is posterior, this is all anterior. That's going to help you going forward. Okay. Let's talk about the tracts of white matter and where they're located within what we call three pairs of columns. That includes the posterior column or posterior white column, which also goes by the term posterior funiculus, which is posterior to what we call the gray commissure. There are two lateral columns, posterior to the lateral horns, one right here, and then where that anterior median fissure is where we find what we call the anterior white column, or just same thing, anterior white funiculus. Okay. So make sure you are able to identify those. It's pretty straightforward. Anterior median fissure is where you find the anterior white column, posterior median sulcus, where you find the posterior white column, and then the two sides will be the lateral white columns. Okay, so that's the makeup of the white matter. Let's talk now about the gray matter. Gray matter, once again, relatively dull color because it contains very little myelin. Can be described as a site of synaptic contact between neurons, and therefore the site of all synaptic integration or information processing of our central nervous system. So in other words, this is where neurons meet, and we can see examples of that right here, where all these little dots that you see would be the cell body of a different neuron, and where the two neurons are meeting, like this blue one and this purple one, is a synapse, all the stuff we just talked about in our last lecture. Okay. Gray matter consists of cell bodies of neurons and neuroglia and unmyelinated axons and dendrites of vernon neurons and motor neurons. We talked about all that stuff in our last lecture. Okay, so what do you need to know about the gray matter? We can basically break it down into a couple pairs of what we call horns. Okay, there are two what we call posterior or dorsal horns, as they're labeled here, posterior gray horns. Okay. This is where the cell bodies and axons of interneurons, as well as axons of incoming sensory neurons, are located. This is where information is coming into the spinal cord for sensations like itch, tickle, hot, cold, pain, pressure, whatever. Those signals are coming into the posterior horns. Okay. Whereas the anterior horn on the other side, this is where you find the cell bodies and the beginning of axons that are carrying signals out for motor neurons. So the anterior or ventral horns contain somatic motor neuron cell bodies providing nerve impulses that enable our muscles to contract. If this is what we're looking at right here, this red neuron, it's going to travel out to our skeletal muscles. Okay. Now, in a certain segment of our spinal cord, not the entire part of our spinal cord, we will also find lateral gray horns. Lateral gray horns are only found in the thoracic and upper lumbar and mid-sacral segments of our spinal cord. Okay, this is where you find the cell body of autonomic motor neurons. Remember, autonomic motor neurons are those that carry signals out to places like our cardiac muscle and our heart, smooth muscle that's like in the middle of our stomach or our bladder or the uterus, as well as glands. Okay. Well, if you think about that part of our spinal cord, the thoracic, upper lumbar, that's pretty close to things like your stomach, your heart, etc. And then the mid-sacral segments of your spinal cord, that's down there by a lot of things like your bladder, the ureters, reproductive urinary type structures. So that would make sense. Those signals are going to come from the spinal cord directly to those organs from our lateral horns. Okay. Now, connecting the two sides of our gray matter is what we call the gray commissure. Gray commissure is kind of like the crossbar of an H. Okay. It just connects the left and right sides. This illustration is pretty simplified, but what it could be showing is that some neurons actually go from one side to the other, enable a signal to go from one side of the spinal cord to the other. And the center of that gray commissure is what we call a central canal. Okay, it extends the entire length of the spinal cord and is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So this is where you'd find those ependymal cells that we just talked about in our last lecture that produce and then circulate the cerebrospinal fluid. At the superior end of the central canal, it is continuous with the fourth ventricle and our medulla oblongata, something that we'll talk about in our next lecture. Okay. Now, another very, very important image. I've spent the last, 10, 15 minutes talking about it, along with the different parts of it. So it is one that you're going to definitely want to know after spring break when you have your exam. I'm not going to worry about everything. So here's what you should highlight. Some of the things that we haven't talked about, I'm going to have you highlight, which include those roots in the spinal nerve. So here's what you need to know. On the top left, I'll start with highlight the following: posterior or dorsal root ganglion, spinal nerve, lateral white column, lateral gray horn, anterior or ventral root of spinal nerve, anterior gray horn, gray commissure. You can skip down to anterior white column, anterior median fissure. We'll call it good there on that side. On the right side, posterior or dorsal root of spinal nerve, posterior gray horn, posterior median sulcus, posterior white column, and then central canal. You don't need to worry about anything else, but make sure you know those things. A very, very important image. There's a very good chance you'll see this one again. All right, so let's talk a little bit about nerves. We've been referencing nerves since the very first slide of our last lecture, where we really just introduced the nervous system. Want to define nerves and then learn about their kind of structural makeup. Give me a second here to finish writing stuff out. All right, our peripheral nervous system, we've talked about this before. It includes 12 pairs of cranial nerves arising from the brain, 31 pairs of spinal nerves arising from the spinal cord. Definition of a nerve is a cord-like organ composed of both sensory and motor neurons bound together by connective tissue. And since it's got both sensory and motor neurons, it can transmit action potentials in opposite directions. Okay, if it's got sensory neurons, that we know means it's carrying signals into, in this case, the brain or spinal cord, or if it's motor neurons, it's carrying signals away from the brain and spinal cord. Well, since a nerve is got both of them, think of a nerve like a two-lane highway. It's got signals going in two different directions. Now, the wonderful thing about a nerve is it's got three connective tissues that help kind of break it into its segments, and those are very similar to the connective tissues that we just learned about that help segment up our muscle. Thinking back to last week when we talked about muscles, we learned about the epi, the peri, and the endomysium. Well, here we have the epi, the peri, and the endoneurium. So it's essentially the same thing. Okay, I'm going to actually start with talking about the bottom one here. The epineurium is the connective tissue on the outside of the nerve. It's a thick outer covering, consists of fibroblasts and thick collagen fibers. And there are extensions of the epineurium that occur between fascicles, like you can see here. Speaking of fascicles, we saw those in muscle. A fascicle is just a bundle of axons. Okay? And surrounding each fascicle is a coat of medium thickness known as the perineurium. That's this kind of orange shaded membrane we can see around each of these little circular structures. Each of those circular structures is a fascicle, and we've pulled one out like so. Okay. Structurally, a perineurium consists of 15 layers of fibroblasts within a network of collagen fibers. So the fibroblasts are the cells, collagen fibers, as we know, protein giving good tensile strength. And then finally, the innermost layer is the endoneurium. It's a thin, loose connective tissue that surrounds the individual axons. In this case, we've opened up one of those and show that this axon is myelinated, but not all neurons are myelinated. So in some cases, you might open up the endoneurium to find an unmyelinated axon inside. Okay. The endoneurium itself consists of a mesh of collagen fibers, fibroblasts, and macrophages. And as I've already mentioned, a group of axons with their endoneurium are arranged together in bundles called fascicles. Okay. Notice here that this is a living structure, and thus it needs blood vessels. Blood vessels are located within the perineurium and epineurium, serving to nourish these nerves. Okay. This is an image that I do want you to know. I don't really care about the term spinal nerve or blood vessels over here on the left, but I would, make sure you know definitely the epineurium, the fascicle, the perineurium, the endoneurium, and since they're labeled and visible, the myelin sheath and axon as well. So pretty darn similar to what we learned just a week and a half ago when we talked about muscles with the epi, the peri, the endomysium. Except now it's neurium. Pretty cool. Down here at the bottom is a real picture under a microscope zooming in at a peripheral nerve. The center you can see very brightly is a blood vessel. But then around the outside, you can find the epineurium. We can see they've bracketed off a fascicle. You can kind of figure out where the other fascicles are. If you look hard, you can kind of see all these little donut-shaped structures. That would be the endoneurium. And then at the center of it, kind of shown there in black, would be the axon. So pretty cool to see where you can see things like the epi, the peri, and the endoneurium we just mentioned. Not something you need to worry about for the exam, though. Okay, so now that we kind of have an idea about nerves, we can actually talk about our spinal nerves and how they work. Certainly. Okay. All right, I've mentioned this several times, but there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We designate them by where they arise in the spinal cord. 8 pairs of cervical, 12 pairs thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 pair from the coccygeal region. In some regions, axons from different levels of spinal cord can come together to form plexuses. giving rise to nerves that can be quite large because they contain axons from multiple spinal cord levels. I go back to that picture of the spinal cord. I told you a little bit ago about these plexuses. They involve basically spinal nerves coming out of the spinal cord or off the spinal cord and then forking together. So they branch together instead of separately, which is kind of unique. And this kind of intricate network, kind of looks like a spider web, is called a plexus. We have several plexuses that eventually form nerves, like from the cervical plexus, these nerves there that feed things like up in our head. In the case of the phrenic nerve, actually even down into the diaphragm. Brachial plexus is the plexus that feeds our arms. So these nerves here are listed, in the case like the ulnar nerve feeds the tips of your pinkies. And we'll get into all that here in a little bit, but that's what a plexus is, okay? Each spinal nerve itself is a mixed nerve composed of bundles of sensory and motor axons, so it's like a two-lane highway, as I just mentioned. These two bundles of axons are called roots and connect each spinal nerve to a segment of the spinal cord by even smaller bundles of axons called rootlets. If I go back once again to this picture, we highlighted things like the posterior root, the anterior root. They were labeled, but I didn't really worry about you knowing them. What we call the rootlets, posterior and anterior. And the two different roots are made up of two different types of neurons. The anterior roots is primarily composed of motor neurons. These motor neurons may be stimulated by either sensory or interneurons, and stimulation of them allows for motor control by upper motor neurons, which are found or which originate up in the motor areas of the brain, as well as for what we call reflexes, like what happens when you step on something sharp or touch something hot. Okay. The posterior or dorsal root is primarily composed of sensory neurons. And we already saw all this stuff here on this page. Okay. We said the posterior horn is associated with signals coming in by way of sensory neurons. Well, they're coming in thanks to the neurons that are inside of the posterior root. The anterior root is associated with the anterior horn, where the signals are leaving the spinal cord, traveling out to skeletal muscles, or if there's signals going to cardiac muscles, smooth muscle, and glands from our autonomic motor neurons. Okay. Now, in the case of the posterior root, there's a little fattened segment of it called the posterior or dorsal root ganglion, which is where you find the cell bodies of those sensory neurons. Remember, most sensory neurons are unipolar in structure, where the cell body is off to the side. So what you end up with, if you've got hundreds of thousands of neurons in this same general area and all their cell bodies are off to the side, it's going to make that segment of that root a little bit fatter. Okay. So that's what I wanted to mention before I even talked about it. I wanted to show it to you. Posterior root of each spinal nerve contains a swelling called the posterior dorsal root ganglion or spinal ganglion, a grouping of sensory neuron cell bodies. In fact, if I go down here to the bottom, we can see, if I zoom in, here's our spinal cord, here's the posterior root, here's the anterior root. You can see on both sides, labeled there is the spinal ganglion, same thing as the posterior root ganglion, it's just a different name. So just before connecting to the spinal cord, a singular spinal nerve has a fork, or it creates two forks, one that goes to the back of the spinal cord, one that goes to the front of the spinal cord. Okay. But then when passing out of the spinal column between the vertebrae, that spinal nerve forks again. Okay. And these forks are called rami, which is the plural form of the word ramus. Okay. The posterior ramus is smaller than the much larger anterior ramus, and it's named the posterior ramus because guess where it goes? To the back side. Okay. It supplies somatic motor and sensory fibers to sever smaller nerves that in turn innervate muscles and skin on the posterior surface of our head, neck, and trunk. So from the back of your head basically to the top of your butt is what that innervates. Okay. Which leaves a lot of the rest of our body left to be innervated, which is done so thanks to the anterior ramus. The anterior or ventral ramus is going to serve muscles and structures of your upper and lower limbs, so your arms and your legs, plus the skin of the lateral and anterior surfaces of our trunk. So it gets your arms and your legs, both front and back, plus the front of your chest and belly, as well as the sides, lateral and surfaces. Except in the thoracic region, the anterior rami of these spinal nerves branch and anastomose or merge, repeatedly forming networks on both left and right sides. These are what those nerve plexuses are. So those plexuses that were labeled here, those are formed from the anterior rami. Okay. And those 5 principal nerve plexuses include the cervical, the brachial, the lumbar, the sacral, and coccygeal plexuses. Emerging from these plexuses are nerves bearing names, often descriptive of the general regions they serve or the course that they take. Each of these may then also have branches that are named for the specific structures that they innervate. What we'll do, and we aren't going to get to this today since we're running short on time, is on Thursday, we'll start going through the plexuses and learning about the different nerves and identifying them, like with this figure here. Now, there's also a couple more rami, addition to the posterior and anterior ramus. The spinal nerves also give off what's called a meningeal branch, which actually goes back into the spinal cavity and therefore supplies the vertebrae, the vertebral ligaments, the blood vessels, and the meninges. Okay. There are also other branches of the spinal nerve called the rami communicantes or communicating rami, components of the autonomic nervous system, and thus play roles in, regulating things like heart rate, blood pressure, and that kind of stuff. I do want you to know this image is not the best because things are so small, but the 3 things over here that are bolded on the left, I definitely want you to know. Over on the right, make sure you know the posterior root, the spinal ganglion or dorsal root ganglion, same thing, the anterior root, and then the communicating rami. Not the best image in the world, but it does show those things I just talked about nonetheless. So it is, what I want you to study. Like I said, on Thursday, when we start class, we'll jump in and start talking about the 5 plexuses and the nerves that branch from them, starting at the top up in your neck where you find the cervical plexus. But for now, we'll stop here. This is a pretty good spot to stop and pick up with things. We have 9 or 10 slides left. Honestly, we'll go pretty quick because a lot of those slides we're buzzing through pretty quickly. So I imagine we got like a half hour left in the lecture, so to get through on Thursday. All right, if I don't see you this afternoon for Phys, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you soon.